She didn't say a word when she boarded the plane, just clutched her feverish baby and collapsed into the seat beside him. He offered his shoulder. She fell asleep. Hours later, he woke up to a name that would change everything he thought he knew about kindness identity and love. This is not just a story about chance. It's about how one quiet moment, one human gesture, can quietly echo through someone's entire life. Before we begin, if you're drawn to stories that restore your faith in humanity, real tender soul, deep stories, be sure to subscribe and turn on the bell so you won't miss what comes next. Now let me take you back to a quiet airport gate on Christmas Eve, where a shoulder, a sleeping child, and a secret changed 3 lives forever. The flight information board flickered once then again, bright red letters blinking across every gate in the terminal delayed. Outside, the snow kept falling, not in gentle flakes, but in thick, blinding sheets that turned the windows of Salt Lake City International into frosted mirrors. A loudspeaker crackled. Flight 438 to Boise has been delayed again. New departure time 3:45 a.m. A soft groan rippled through the few passengers still lingering in the terminal. It was Christmas Eve, and the magic had worn thin. Elliot Granger sat alone at gate 17 elbows, resting on a scratched aluminum bench, his fingers running absently along the spine of a leather-bound book in his lap. Of Mice and Men. Faded gold script. The same book his grandfather had given him 2 decades earlier, with a note inside that read, "Son, if you ever forget who you are, read this. And if someone ever needs a place to rest, give them your shoulder. It's the most American thing you can do." Elliot had once been a firefighter, a rescuer, a man with a home, a dog, a truck that worked on the first try, and a woman who believed in forever. But forever ended 5 years ago in a house fire that claimed more than lives. It took his will. Since then, life had been quiet. Too quiet. He was flying to Boise not for family, but for the funeral of Mr. Wexler, his high school music teacher. The only man who kept checking on him when others stopped. The only person who still sent him Christmas cards signed, "I still believe in you." Elliot leaned back and closed his eyes. He could almost hear the gentle plucking of a guitar echoing in Mr. Wexler's classroom. Then a sound pulled him back to the present. Coughing. Dry. Persistent. Followed by the tiny whimpering cries of an infant. He opened his eyes. Across the aisle just near the corner of the terminal, where the vending machines buzzed like forgotten ghosts, a young woman staggered into view. She looked no older than 25, wrapped in a threadbare coat, far too thin for the Utah winter. Her cheeks were windburned, her lips chapped. She clutched a baby bundled in mismatched blankets, its face flushed with fever. No one moved. No one looked up. Everyone was too buried in their phones, their earbuds, their own exhaustion. Elliot stood. He didn't think. He just moved. Crossing the floor, he stepped in front of her as she struggled to lower herself into a plastic seat. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. She blinked up at him, startled. Her eyes were wide gray blue like the overcast sky outside. She tried to answer, but only managed a hoarse whisper. "Just tired." The baby let out a shrill cry. The woman bounced it softly, murmuring something Elliot couldn't make out. "Here," he said, shrugging off his coat. "Your baby's burning up." She started to protest, but he gently wrapped the coat around the baby. Then, without waiting, he sat beside her. "I'm Elliot." She hesitated. "Grace." For a moment they sat in silence. Then Grace's head began to bob. Her shoulders trembled and her arms shook from holding the baby for so long. Elliot held out his arms. "Let me," he offered. She stared at him, not with fear, but with something raw shame, vulnerability. Still she nodded, and placed the baby into his arms. It had been years since Elliot held something so delicate. The child was warm, too warm, but relaxed against his chest, with a trust he hadn't felt in ages. Grace let out a long, shaky exhale, and as if the weight had finally shifted, she leaned sideways and let her head fall on his shoulder. It wasn't planned. It wasn't romantic. It was human. And that was enough. Time passed quietly. Elliot sat still, breathing in time with the baby, careful not to shift his shoulder too suddenly. Grace slept. For the first time in who knows how long, her expression softened. The terminal around them hummed in half-light. At 3:15 a.m., a janitor pushing a mop paused. He stared at the trio for a moment. The quiet man, the baby, the girl curled up on his shoulder, and smiled to himself. He pulled out his phone. No flash. One photo. Then he moved on. At 3:42 a.m., the boarding call came. Grace stirred, confused, embarrassed. "I did. I fall asleep." Elliot nodded, adjusting the baby gently in her arms. "Don't worry, you needed it." She looked at him with a sudden tightness in her throat. "Thank you," he simply smiled. "It's Christmas Eve. No one should be cold or alone." They rose and headed toward the gate together. Neither of them knew what waited in Boise. Neither knew that the photo taken that night would soon go viral. And neither of them could have guessed that this quiet moment, just a shoulder in the night, would be the first step toward a miracle neither of them saw coming. The cabin lights dimmed as Flight 438 began its slow ascent into the dark sky above Salt Lake City. Snow still drifted beyond the small windows, but inside the plane there was a hush, one born of weariness, and that shared silent surrender every red-eye flight carried. People weren't talking. They were retreating into the silence between exhaustion and sleep. Elliot Granger sat in seat 14C, elbows and hands resting loosely on his knees. Beside him, Grace cradled her baby girl against her chest, both wrapped in his heavy firefighter's coat. She hadn't spoken since they boarded. She hadn't needed to. Ren the baby had finally stopped whimpering. Grace was humming a lullaby under her breath, not melodic, but instinctive, almost like breathing. Something about the way she moved, fluid, careful, hyper-aware, told Elliot she'd been doing this alone for a while. Maybe longer than she should have. He watched her from the corner of his eye, unsure whether to speak or stay still. For the first time in years, he found himself curious. "You can rest," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. "I'll keep an eye on her." She looked at him, eyes narrowed in consideration, not suspicion. Then a slow, almost reluctant nod. "If I fall asleep again, just don't let me miss anything." "You won't," he promised. She adjusted her position gently, laid her head against his shoulder again, and in less than a minute, her breathing evened out. He sat frozen for a moment, not out of discomfort, but because something about this felt right in a way that was foreign and a little terrifying. The warmth of her against his arm, the faint scent of something floral in her hair, the complete trust of a stranger. These were things he hadn't expected to carry with him tonight. He stared ahead at nothing. Grace Alder. That was the name she gave. It rang somewhere in his memory like a faint bell in the fog. But Elliot had learned to respect silence more than curiosity. If people wanted to talk, they would. If they didn't, they probably had good reason. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that just 3 years ago, Grace Langford Alder had been a rising name in every financial and society magazine in New York. Heiress to Langford Holdings. Ivy League educated. Engaged to a congressman's son. The kind of woman whose photos were taken, not snapped. The kind of woman who wore power like perfume. But now she sat in economy, pressed against a stranger's shoulder, with no jewelry. No makeup and no trace of the life she once had, except for the delicate chain around her neck, half hidden by her collar, and the antique locket it carried. a locket she hadn't opened in months. "Would you like water?" the flight attendant whispered, pausing beside their row. Elliot shook his head, gesturing toward Grace. "She's asleep." The attendant leaned in with a knowing look. "Is that your wife?" He hesitated. "No." "Girlfriend." Another pause. "No. Just someone who needed rest more than I did." The attendant's expression shifted, softened. "That's kind of you." Elliot looked down at the baby in her mother's arms. "I think it should be normal." Somewhere over Idaho, Grace stirred. The seatbelt sign blinked off. She blinked slowly, disoriented. "Did I drool on you?" she asked sleepily. Elliot chuckled. "You're good." She sat up straight, rubbing her eyes, and adjusted Wren in her arms. "You said your name's Elliot." He nodded. "Elliot what, Granger?" Her lips parted as if the name touched something she hadn't expected. But she said nothing, only nodded. "I haven't slept like that in weeks," she murmured. "Months, maybe. Babies'll do that to you." She tilted her head. "You've got kids." A soft breath. Almost. Once. She looked away, not out of discomfort, but in quiet respect. "Sorry," she said. "It's all right," he replied. "Some losses get heavier when you hold them alone." But tonight didn't feel so heavy. She turned to look at him. For the first time, the hardness in her features cracked. She was young, but there were years etched into her expression. Years of pressure. Fear. Running. "Do you believe in second chances?" she asked. Elliot looked down at his hands, then at her. "I believe in giving them. Still figuring out if I believe in getting one." She smiled, tired, but real. As the plane began its descent, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Boise. Local time is 5:08 a.m., and the weather is a brisk 23 degrees, with clear skies." Grace pulled her coat tighter. Wren stirred but did not cry. Elliot stood helping her with her small, scuffed diaper bag. "You heading somewhere in Boise?" he asked casually. "I have family matters," she said. "Unfinished business," he nodded. "I'm just going to a funeral." "I'm sorry, me too." They stepped into the aisle together, moving with the rest of the half-sleeping passengers toward the front. As they reached the exit, Grace turned to him. "I don't usually fall asleep on strangers," she said. "I don't usually offer my shoulder to them," he replied. They both smiled. Outside the gate, fluorescent lights flickered. A suited man holding a leather folder stood waiting, flanked by two others in black coats. As soon as he saw Grace, he stepped forward, eyes relieved but formal. "Miss Alder, we've been looking for you. Your grandfather passed away last night. The estate is waiting." Elliot turned sharply. Grace froze. The man continued. "Your presence is required for the reading of the will. I have transportation ready." The baby stirred in her arms. "I wasn't sure I was ready to come back," Grace whispered, mostly to herself. Elliot watched her, then gently touched her elbow. "Then, maybe the world's ready for you." Grace Alder didn't say a word as the suited man led her toward the waiting black car just outside the terminal. The baby in her arms let out a soft, breathy sigh, half sleep, half uncertainty. It matched her own. Elliot stood back, hesitant. He had no claim to this moment. He wasn't family or even a friend. Just a man who'd offered his coat his shoulder and 2 hours of quiet in the middle of a snowstorm. But still, something tugged at his feet. He hadn't expected to care this much, and he didn't understand why he suddenly didn't want to let her go. Grace turned back to him. There was a long pause before she spoke. "Would you come with me?" Elliot blinked. "I don't think I should. You've got people waiting." "That's the problem," she said, her voice just above a whisper. "They're not my people. They're just people. Lawyers. Assistants. Legacy handlers." The words came out with a bitterness he hadn't heard before. It was the voice of someone used to being spoken about instead of spoken to. Elliot hesitated, then glanced out at the still dark Boise morning. "I've got time." She nodded once sharply and turned back toward the car. He followed. The ride through Boise was hushed. The streets were empty, still sleeping off Christmas Eve. The headlights cut through mist, like ghosts remembering old paths. In the back seat, Grace kept her hand on the baby's chest, feeling each breath like it was proof she was still grounded. Elliot sat across from her, unsure where to put his hands, unsure whether to speak. "Her name's Wren Grace," said suddenly. Elliot looked up. Like the bird, she nodded. "My mother used to say wrens were the bravest of all birds. Small, quiet, but they always find their way home." Elliot smiled softly. "That sounds right." She looked down at her daughter, then added, "I didn't run away because I hated who I was. I ran because I didn't know how to protect this little person and stay in that world at the same time." What world? Grace looked out the window as the city gave way to estates, manicured lawns, iron gates, cold columns lit by harsh exterior lights. The kind where names matter more than kindness, where power is the currency of love. He didn't press, he just listened. And Grace, sensing that, went on. "I was supposed to marry someone who looked good in a magazine. The wedding was already in Vanity Fair before I called it off. My grandfather, he didn't yell, he didn't cry, he just said, 'If you walk away, don't expect to be welcomed back.' So I left. But now he's gone. And here I am." Elliot didn't reply right away. Then finally, "Maybe he didn't stop loving you. Maybe he just didn't know how to forgive you while he was still proud." Grace turned to him, searching his face. "Do you always say things like that?" He shrugged. "Only when I believe them." The car pulled through a wrought iron gate and up a long gravel driveway flanked by bare oaks and stately pines. The house, if it could be called that, was out of the earth, like a memory too large to let go. Langford Estate. Elliot swallowed. He felt out of place in his boots and weathered jacket. But Grace didn't seem to notice. She got out of the car with Wren in her arms, and Elliot followed. Inside, the air was still and cool, like the house had been holding its breath. A butler nodded curtly and motioned them toward the drawing room. It was filled with leather chairs, mahogany shelves, and the faint scent of cigars. On the mantel sat a photo of a man in his 80s, stern, dignified with deep-set eyes, and a jaw that didn't know compromise. Grace glanced at it but didn't speak. A lawyer entered with a satchel and an envelope. His voice was precise and practiced. "As per the final instructions of Mr. Langford, the estate is to be read in the presence of his granddaughter, Miss Grace Alder." She nodded, clutching Wren a little tighter. The lawyer unfolded the letter and began to read aloud. The words were legal at first, property stocks holdings. But then they softened. To Grace. "You were always the quietest of my legacy, but perhaps the most watchful. I regret what I said to you when you left, not because I didn't mean it, but because I did. And I see now that I was wrong. You chose love over image. That used to be weakness in my eyes. Now it's the only strength I envy." The room went still. "I leave you this home not because of obligation, but because it needs someone who can make it gentle again. I leave you my name, not because it is valuable, but because you've given it back its worth." Grace's throat tightened. She lowered her head as silent tears traced the angles of her face. "And if by chance you are holding your child while reading this, then my only request is that you teach her what I could not teach you in time, that being seen is not as important as being kind." When the lawyer finished, Grace didn't speak. She simply nodded, then quietly asked for some time alone. She stepped out into the old garden behind the house. Wren sleeping soundly now, and Elliot followed at a respectful distance. Snow blanketed the hedges. The wind stirred the empty rose beds. She sat on a bench beneath a leafless oak. "I thought he hated me," she whispered. "He didn't," Elliot said gently. "He just couldn't bend until it was too late." She looked at him, eyes clear, as if searching for what had made her trust this man so quickly. Then she asked, "Why did you stay?" Elliot thought about that for a long moment. "Because you looked like someone who needed a place to land. And maybe I needed to remember what it felt like to be needed." Morning spread slowly across Langford Estate, casting amber light over the stone pathways and the long-forgotten corners of the winter garden. The world here seemed to move in hushes and echoes. Even the snow didn't crunch the way it did on ordinary streets. It settled, hush-deverent. Grace sat at the long kitchen table, now empty of servants and ceremony, save for the quiet ticking of a grandfather clock behind her. Wren was sleeping in a bassinet nearby, her cheeks flushed with health for the first time in days. The old house creaked with history, but Grace had never felt more aware of the present. Elliot entered the kitchen cautiously, a mug of coffee in hand, steam rising between his fingers. He hesitated before stepping too far in. "You okay?" he asked. Grace nodded. "Still feels like I'm walking through someone else's dream." He pulled out a chair across from her. "Looks more like a mausoleum than a home." She let out a breath, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. It was always like that. Rooms that looked like nobody lived in them. Rules no one wrote down but everyone followed. As a kid, I used to hide under the grand piano just to feel something echo. Sounds lonely. It was. They both stared at the surface of the table. It was too polished to be comfortable, the kind of wood you weren't allowed to touch. Elliot set his mug down carefully. "You don't have to stay here, you know. Just because someone leaves you a house doesn't mean you owe them your life." Grace nodded slowly. "But sometimes, maybe it's not about what you owe them. Maybe it's about what you owe yourself." Later that morning, a young woman named Elise arrived at the estate, soft-spoken, dressed in professional gray, holding a leather portfolio and a box of personal effects from the Langford office. "I was Mr. Langford's executive assistant," she said, smiling at Grace with something that resembled relief. "He wasn't always easy. But he kept your photo on his desk, right up until the day he died." Grace blinked. "He told me not to come back." Elise nodded gently. "Yes. But he also made weekly donations to the shelter you volunteered at in Chicago, anonymously. And when Wren was born, he called to ask if she was healthy." Grace swallowed. Her eyes shifted toward the snowy window. "He knew where I was. He always knew," Elise said softly. "He just didn't know how to say he missed you." There was a pause. Grace turned to Elliot, standing quietly in the doorway. "I guess some people love best from far away," she murmured. By midday, the house had begun to feel less like a cathedral of ghosts and more like the shell of something once important. Grace wandered from room to room, not out of nostalgia, but inspection, testing the edges of a life she once abandoned. In the library, dust motes danced in the shafts of light like snowflakes. Grace ran her fingers across the spines of untouched books. When she reached the grand piano in the music room, she paused. Elliot watched her from the threshold. "He taught me to play," she said. "Only person who did. I used to sneak down here in the middle of the night and play in the dark. Play something," he said. "I don't know if I remember. You don't forget what made you feel alive." She sat, touched one key, then another. The melody was tentative, like a bird testing its wings after a storm. But then it took flight. A lullaby, the same one she hummed to Wren on the flight. Elliot stood quietly as her music filled the room. He closed his eyes, and something inside him, a thing locked up for far too long, shifted. That evening, Grace lit the fireplace in the drawing room. Not a servant, not a staff member, Grace. With her own hands. The flame crackled to life, and for the first time in years, warmth reached the corners of the estate. Elliot sat across from her, watching her rock. Wren gently the baby, now quiet and pink-cheeked in the firelight. "Are you going to stay?" he asked. Grace was quiet. "Then I don't know. I thought I left this place because it suffocated me. But maybe I left because I didn't believe I had the power to change it. You do now." She looked at him. Really looked. "You don't talk much, do you?" she said. He grinned. "I talk when it matters." She smiled back. It was the first time he'd seen her truly smile, not the tired, polite one, but something honest. "Stay a little longer," she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Longer than I planned," he said, "but not as long as I want." Grace laughed softly, then glanced down at Wren. She's never slept this peacefully before. "She trusts you." Grace tilted her head. "What about you?" Elliot looked into her eyes. "I'm getting there." That night, long after the fire died down and the estate lay quiet again, Elliot stood by a window overlooking the garden. The moon was high. Snow still blanketed the hedges, but something felt different. Less still. Less empty. Behind him, Grace stepped quietly into the room. She carried a thick envelope. "What's that?" he asked. "My grandfather's journal. It was in the desk in his bedroom. He wrote in it almost every day after I left." Elliot raised an eyebrow. "You going to read it? I don't know yet. Maybe you don't need to." She nodded. Maybe not. Then she stepped beside him, close enough for their arms to brush. They said nothing, but in the silence between them, something real had begun to grow. Not out of romance, not out of pity, but from a simple truth. Sometimes the most beautiful beginnings come from people who show up, quietly. The morning after the reading of the will dawned brighter than expected. Sunlight broke through the frost-covered windows of Langford Estate, casting a golden hue on the stone floors and antique furniture, as if the house itself had taken a breath. It had been a long time since warmth, real warmth, had lived in these halls. Grace sat on the front steps of the estate, wrapped in a cream-colored wool shawl, her legs tucked beneath her. Wren slept in a small bassinet beside her, shaded from the sun. She watched the sky rather than the trees. There was something about wide open air that made her feel less cornered. Inside the house, Elliot moved quietly. He had made breakfast, nothing fancy, just toast, scrambled eggs, and a strong pot of coffee, but he left it untouched on the kitchen counter. He was learning that sometimes the best help was silence with presence, and he had come to recognize that Grace's silences were never empty. They were full of things she didn't yet trust the world to hear. But this morning felt different. Grace looked up when she heard the soft creak of the screen door. "You always, this quiet in the morning?" she asked, without turning her head. Elliot sat down next to her on the step. "Only when I'm trying not to scare someone off." She cracked a smile. "You're not that scary." He shrugged. "Used to be. Or maybe I was just closed off enough to seem that way." Grace nodded slowly. "Yeah, I know that feeling." They sat for a long moment, the silence stretching comfortably between them. Then, as if something inside her had finally settled enough to be spoken aloud, Grace began to speak. "Do you know why I didn't come back?" she asked. Elliot looked at her, but didn't answer. He knew she wasn't really asking for a reply. It wasn't just the pressure, or the legacy, or even the engagement my grandfather arranged. She paused, gathering herself. "I fell in love," she said. "Not with a senator's son, not with a corporate heir. Just someone. A man I met working at a community center in the Bronx. His name was Elijah. He wasn't polished, didn't have the right last name. But he had this way of looking at people like they mattered, even when they didn't believe it themselves. Elliot stayed quiet, listening. When I told my grandfather, he barely blinked, just said, "That will not do." I said I was keeping the baby. He said I could keep it, or keep the family name. Not both. She let out a breath that trembled at the edges. I walked away. Elijah, he didn't make it. Car accident. Just 2 months before Ren was born. No insurance, no family. Just gone. Elliot looked down, his heart tightening in his chest. And I didn't want pity, she continued. I didn't want headlines. I didn't want to be the tragic heiress with the orphaned baby. So I disappeared. I worked cleaning offices doing part-time tutoring. Sometimes I'd sleep on the floor beside her crib just to make sure she was breathing. Elliot turned to her, his voice low and steady. You didn't run. You survived. She met his eyes. I didn't think anyone would ever say that to me. He offered her a half smile. I don't say things I don't mean. Grace looked back toward the garden. I thought coming back here would be the hardest thing I've ever done. But the hardest part was believing I deserved to come back. Elliot didn't answer with words. He reached out and gently placed his hand over hers. No pressure, no promises, just warmth. Presence. I came here to say goodbye to a man who once believed in me, Elliot said. Didn't expect to find someone still learning to believe in herself. Grace's fingers curled around his. I don't know what I'm doing, she whispered. Neither do I, he said. But we're here. That's something. That afternoon, Grace opened the door to a sunlit room she hadn't entered since she was 16. It had been her childhood bedroom once, before the mansion swallowed it up in expectations. The wallpaper was still the same soft blue. A stuffed rabbit sat on a shelf, one ear torn. Her initials, GLA, were still etched into the window frame from the night she and her brother dared each other to carve something permanent. She turned to Elliot. I want to stay, she said. He nodded. I want Ren to have a room like this, one where she feels safe, one that doesn't smell like power, but like pancakes and crayons. Elliot laughed, the sound genuine and low. You gonna build her a fort in the closet too? Only if you help, she said. He nodded again, but softer this time. I will. Later that night, Grace sat at the piano in the music room. Ren was asleep upstairs. Elliot leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. She began to play, hesitant, then growing in confidence. It wasn't a flawless performance. Notes slipped. A chord wavered. But it was real. Alive. Hers. When she finished, she looked at Elliot with a hint of mischief. Your turn. He raised an eyebrow. I can barely play Twinkle Twinkle. Then start there. She scooted over on the bench. He joined her. Their hands shared the same keys. Their laughter filled the spaces between notes. It was clumsy, unpracticed, messy, and utterly human. As the fireplace cracked beside them, and the old estate seemed to breathe again, Elliot turned to her. Do you think your grandfather would be okay with this? Grace looked around. I think, for the first time, he wouldn't mind the noise. Grace hadn't planned to go online. She rarely did anymore. The digital world was too loud, too fast, too ready to remind her of things she'd spent years trying to forget. But that morning, as she stood in the sunlit kitchen of Langford Estate, cradling a warm mug of chamomile tea, she caught sight of Elliot standing by the hallway mirror, holding a phone in his hand. His brow furrowed. He wasn't scrolling. He wasn't even moving. Everything okay? She asked. He looked up at her slowly. Have you seen this? She took the phone from his hand, eyes narrowing at the headline. The Shoulder America forgot it had strangers caught in Christmas act of quiet kindness. Melt millions of hearts beneath the title was the photo, the one taken in the airport. Grainy, unposed, perfectly imperfect. Her head on Elliot's shoulder. Wren swaddled in his coat. The three of them tucked into a corner of Gate 17, wrapped in exhaustion and warmth. Grace stared at the image. Her stomach tightened. "I didn't know someone had taken that," she whispered. Elliot stepped beside her. "Neither did I. But apparently, it's everywhere now." She scrolled down. Thousands of comments. Faith in humanity restored. This man didn't know her name but gave her his shoulder. "We need more Elliots in the world. Reminds me of when my husband held a stranger's baby during a storm delay. Been married 40 years now." Grace looked up. "I don't know how to feel about this," he nodded. "It's strange having a moment that felt so private turned into a national headline." Grace exhaled. "This wasn't supposed to happen. I didn't want to be seen. Not like this." "But maybe it's not about being seen," Elliot said gently. "Maybe it's about what people see in it. In us." She looked at him, searching for something in his expression. "You're okay with this?" He shrugged. "I'm not used to being called a symbol of anything. But if that photo makes someone help a stranger or reach out to a lonely neighbor, I can live with it." Grace turned the phone back over, hiding the screen. "I spent so many years trying not to be found. And now, I'm a viral headline." "You were found," Elliot said. "Just not in the way they think." By noon, a local news crew showed up outside the estate gates. A woman with a microphone bundled in layers called out to the intercom with cheerful persistence. "Ms. Grace Alder, we'd love to speak to the mystery mother from the photo. Boise wants to hear your story." Grace watched from behind the curtains. Elliot stood beside her, arms folded. "They're going to keep coming, aren't they?" she asked. "For a while," he replied. "But they'll get bored. Headlines always do." Grace shook her head. This place was never supposed to be part of that world again. Not for me. Not for Wren. You could give them something else to talk about. She turned to him. "Like what? Like how kindness doesn't need an audience. Like how this isn't about a viral photo, it's about rebuilding a home. Quietly. On your own terms." She hesitated. Then after a moment she smiled. "Let's give them a different story." That afternoon, Grace reached out to a local women's shelter in downtown Boise, the same one her grandfather had secretly donated to for years. She offered to cover the cost of winter clothing for the mothers and children staying there. No cameras, no interviews, just a delivery van and handwritten cards tucked into each coat pocket. "You are not forgotten. You are not invisible. You are loved, from a shoulder that once needed one too." Elliot helped carry boxes. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. Word spread not from press releases or social media, but through word of mouth, whispered stories that traveled from shelter kitchens to church basements to quiet conversations at grocery store checkouts. Later that week, as snow began to fall again, Grace stood at the back of the estate garden, now cleared of ice and overgrowth. The old greenhouse, long forgotten, still stood, its glass-cracked frame, rusted, but structure intact. "I want to turn this into something," she said. Elliot stood beside her. "Like what a space for other women. Women who need quiet. Time. Maybe a place to sit and breathe." Elliot nodded. "You've already started." She turned to him. "I was so afraid that coming back meant surrender, that it meant letting my past win. But now you know," he said, "that it's your story. You get to write the next chapter." She looked at him. Really looked. "You're part of that, you know." He paused. "I'm not used to being written into good stories." "Well," she said softly, "maybe it's time." That evening by the fireplace, Elliot found a worn shoebox tucked into a cabinet beneath the stairs. He brought it to the living room where Grace was rocking Wren to sleep. "What's that?" she asked. "I think it belonged to your grandfather." Inside were dozens of letters, unmailed, most of them written in ink, that had begun to fade, each addressed simply to Grace. She picked one at random, hands trembling slightly. As she read, her eyes welled with tears. "I watched the news tonight. They said you'd started a tutoring program for low-income kids. I told no one, but I was proud. If I'd had your courage at your age, maybe I wouldn't have lost your mother the way I did. Maybe I wouldn't be so afraid to say the one thing I've never said out loud. I'm sorry, Gracie. For everything." She didn't read the rest. She didn't need to. Elliot sat beside her, saying nothing. Sometimes all you needed was someone willing to sit with you in the middle of your reckoning. As Wren shifted gently in her sleep and the fire crackled low, Grace leaned her head on Elliot's shoulder once more. No cameras this time. No strangers watching. Just a shoulder and the silence between two people learning how to breathe again. Langford Estate had begun to shift. It wasn't anything grand, not yet. No sudden renovations, no televised charity galas or sweeping gestures. But change had settled in the quiet spaces, in the warmth that returned to the hearth, in the smell of cinnamon from Grace's morning tea, and in the faint sound of laughter drifting from the kitchen. It was the kind of change that didn't announce itself, but lived in the air like spring, waiting just beneath snow. Grace stood in the hallway just outside the music room holding Wren on her hip. Elliot had taken it upon himself to oil the piano pedals, wiping the brass clean with an old rag. He didn't speak as he worked, didn't need to. The room, once museum silent, now pulsed gently with life again. "I used to play in here every night," Grace said softly, "when I couldn't sleep, when I felt invisible." Elliot looked up. "And now," she glanced down at Wren. "Now I want this room to echo with different things." He smiled. "Then we make it happen." That afternoon they worked together to open up the west wing of the estate, long abandoned, locked after Grace's mother died, when she was still a teenager. Dust coated the floors, furniture sat under drapes, and light came through in narrow shafts, like secrets trying to get in. The air smelled like memories. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Elliot asked, watching her run her hand along a dusty banister. Grace nodded. "This house has been too quiet for too long." They uncovered portraits, old, stiff, oil-rendered ancestors who never learned how to smile. Grace stared at one of her mother, a woman with the same cheekbones, the same contemplative gaze. "I used to think she didn't love this place," she murmured. "Now I wonder if she loved it too much and didn't know how to breathe inside it." Elliot stayed beside her, never reaching to touch, only staying near enough to anchor her. She turned to him. "Do you believe places can be haunted not by ghosts, but by silence?" "I do," he said. "But I also believe in clearing it out." By evening, they had turned the once sealed hallway into a corridor filled with fresh air and open windows. Grace had uncovered an old cedar toy chest in one of the bedrooms and placed it beside Wren's crib. "She'll grow into this space," Grace whispered, "and it won't belong to shadows." Word of the Langford heiress's quiet return continued to spread, though Grace kept herself away from it all. She declined interview requests. She ignored press inquiries. When a local journalist sent a handwritten letter requesting a 5-minute conversation, she sent back a 1-sentence reply. When kindness becomes spectacle, it forgets how to heal. Instead, she and Elliot focused on tangible things, real things. They met with a local carpenter about converting the unused stables into classrooms for single mothers who wanted to learn trades. Grace offered scholarships to women in shelters. Elliot began restoring the old barn, planning to turn it into a music and woodworking space for kids. "What would you call it?" Grace asked one night, curled on the couch, Wren asleep between them. He thought a moment. "The quiet room," he said. She looked at him. "Why? Because sometimes healing needs silence, and sometimes silence needs a safe place to be loud again." The more they worked, the more the house softened. Grace began baking again, not from need, but for joy. She filled the kitchen with the scent of banana bread and rosemary focaccia, often laughing when the dough stuck to Wren's curious fingers. She and Elliot began taking walks in the early morning light, Wren nestled in her carrier, bundled like a tiny explorer. The estate's frozen grounds slowly thawed under their steps. During one of those walks, Grace paused near the old greenhouse. "I want to turn this into a living garden," she said. "Not just plants memories, something people can walk through and feel held." Elliot looked at her. "That's what you've been doing all along." She smiled. "Maybe I'm finally letting myself believe it." Then one afternoon, Grace received a letter in an envelope lined with gold trim. The Langford Foundation Board requested her attendance at an emergency session. Though she was now the majority shareholder, her presence was technically optional. But the letter was signed by men who had once told her she was too emotional to lead, too impulsive, too soft. Grace stood by the fireplace, letter in hand, Elliot beside her. "They want to know what I'm doing with the estate," she said. "Why I'm investing in people instead of portfolios. What will you tell them?" She took a breath, folded the letter, and set it aside. "I'll tell them I'm giving this place back to the people it forgot." She looked at Elliot. "And I want you with me." He hesitated. "You're sure?" She nodded. "This isn't just my house anymore. It's becoming our home." That night, Grace opened the door to the music room again. She sat at the piano, Elliot beside her, Wren curled on a blanket by their feet. Together, they played not perfectly, not in rhythm, but in harmony. The house, for the first time in years, echoed not with silence, but with the music of new beginnings. The church hall was nothing like Langford Estate. Its floors were linoleum, its chairs metal and squeaky, and the coffee came from an old percolator that sputtered like it had been serving Grace since the 70s. But Elliot liked it. There was honesty in chipped tile and hand-painted signs and people who showed up because they wanted to, not because they had to. Grace had insisted on coming. "This is where the real stories are," she said, shifting Wren and her carrier as they entered. "Not in boardrooms, not in gala speeches. Here." Elliot couldn't disagree. The event was a modest community fundraiser organized by a women's shelter, the same one Grace had quietly supported. There were no photographers, no press, just families, paper plates stacked with brownies, and tired eyes with glints of hope behind them. He had intended to stay in the background, but someone had other plans. Near the end of the evening, the shelter director, an older woman named Joni, with wild silver curls and a voice like gravel wrapped in velvet, tapped a fork to her glass. "We've got someone special here tonight," she said. "You may not know him, but I guarantee you've seen him." "That's right, he's the shoulder in that photo." "You know the one." A soft chuckle swept through the room. Grace glanced at Elliot with a mischievous smile. Joni continued, "Elliot Granger. Would you mind saying a few words?" His body tensed. He hadn't spoken in front of a crowd since his firehouse farewell. 5 years earlier, a farewell whispered in embarrassment and quiet grief. But now, as people turned their faces toward him, not in judgment, but curiosity, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Permission. Grace nudged him gently. "Go. Be who you are." He stood slowly, heart knocking against his ribs like it wanted out. He took the mic with a dry throat and cleared it softly. "I don't usually speak in places like this," he began. "I don't usually speak much at all." A few people chuckled warmly. "But I guess You all know me now as the guy with the shoulder." More laughter. Kinder this time. He nodded. It's strange becoming a symbol for something you never intended to do. I didn't save anyone that night. I just gave someone a place to lean. I didn't even know her name. He looked at Grace. Her eyes shimmered in the soft overhead light. But that moment, simple as it was, reminded me of something I'd forgotten. That being strong doesn't always mean standing tall. Sometimes it means being still enough for someone else to rest. The room quieted. Not out of politeness, but connection. "I used to be a firefighter," he continued. "Used to think that only the big saves counted. Pulling someone out of a building. Taking the hit. Earning the medal. But grief has a way of teaching you what endurance really means. And I learned that healing is often quiet. Hidden. Small. Like letting someone fall asleep without fear." He swallowed. "I lost a lot before I found that airport bench. But in that moment, holding a stranger's baby and being still for someone else, I remembered I still had something left to give." He paused. Turns out sometimes a shoulder is enough. When he sat down, the room didn't erupt into applause. Instead, it gave him something better. Silence. The good kind. The kind that wrapped around you like wool on a cold day. Joni wiped her eyes with a napkin. "You've got a gift, son." He smiled faintly. "I didn't know that until someone leaned on me." Grace reached for his hand beneath the table, her fingers wrapping around his. "I think the world just heard your voice," she whispered. Later that evening, they stood outside the church, the night air crisp, but not cruel. Snow hadn't fallen yet, but the sky promised it would. Elliot leaned against the hood of the car, hands deep in his coat pockets. "I thought I'd buried that part of me," he said. "What part?" "The part that believed I could help, that I was worth listening to." Grace looked at him, then took a slow step forward. "You didn't bury it. You protected it until someone deserved to see it again." He turned to her. "You really believe that I do," she said. "Because I've been carrying pieces of myself for years, hoping someone would see past the silence." She reached up, brushed snow off his shoulder. "I see you." He exhaled. The words, so simple, so rarely spoken, broke something open in him he didn't realize was still sealed. Then carefully, as if testing the air between them, he bent his head toward hers. She met him halfway. It wasn't a kiss filled with urgency or drama. It wasn't movie perfect or planned. It was gentle, certain, like two people who had learned to recognize the value of quiet choosing, finally to let go of the past. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. "No one's ever called me a gift before," he whispered. "They didn't look closely enough," she replied. That night, back at the estate, Grace laid Wren in her crib. Elliot stood in the hallway, watching her hum softly, a lullaby half remembered from another life. He realized then that he wasn't just helping Grace heal. She was helping him remember the sound of a home. Grace found the letter on a quiet Wednesday morning tucked inside the back of a drawer she hadn't opened in over a decade. The mahogany desk sat in the corner of her grandfather's private study, an austere room she used to avoid. It still smelled faintly of tobacco and leather, and the air even now held its own weight. But on that morning, with light slanting through the half-drawn curtains, and Wren playing quietly on a rug nearby, the room felt softer. The letter was unsealed, folded 3 times. Her name scrawled across the front in her grandfather's unmistakable hand, elegant, deliberate. She hesitated before opening it. She'd spent years imagining what he might have written to her if pride hadn't stood between them. She wasn't sure she wanted his words now. Not after all this time. But something about Elliot's voice in her memory. Maybe he just didn't know how to forgive you while he was still proud, made her fingers move. She unfolded the letter slowly, the paper fragile from age, and waiting. My dearest Grace, by the time you read this, I suspect I will no longer be around to argue with you. Perhaps that's for the best. I never was good at saying what I meant the first time. I was cruel to you. I know that. I held you to a standard I barely lived up to myself. I told myself it was for the sake of the name, the legacy. But truthfully, I was afraid. Afraid that if you lived by your heart, it would unravel everything I built from logic and control. But here's the secret, Grace. You were right to leave. You were right to choose love. And though I could not say it aloud, I watched you. Don't ask how I always knew where you were. And every report I received, every letter Joni at the shelter forwarded me about your kindness, your strength. They were a balm to my regrets. You are not a failure to this family. You are its redemption. And Wren, she is the gift I never deserved, but hope to be forgiven through. I wish I had told you all this sooner. I wish I had known how. Love in the only way I knew. James Langford. Grace read the final line again and again until her eyes blurred. She didn't cry right away. The tears came slowly, the kind that sit behind the ribs and ache before they fall. She folded the letter back into its envelope, pressed it to her chest, and closed her eyes. She had waited years to hear those words. She just hadn't realized she still needed them. That evening, Elliot found her on the back patio, curled in a blanket, a mug of tea cooling in her hands. The garden beyond had begun to bloom again, in patches, early crocuses, rising through the last of the snow. He sat down beside her without speaking. She handed him the letter. He read it silently, then exhaled a long breath. He did love you. Grace nodded, but he didn't know how to show it until it was too late. Sometimes that's all people can do. Leave us the truth in fragments. She looked at him, her voice low. I think, for a long time, I needed him to say I did the right thing, that I wasn't selfish, that I wasn't a disappointment. You weren't, Elliot said simply. I know that now. But hearing it finally brought back the girl who waited years to believe it. Elliot reached over, took her hand. You're not that girl anymore. No, she said, squeezing his fingers. I'm a woman who's building something better. Not because I have to prove anything, but because I finally want to. The next morning, Grace pulled out a fresh sheet of stationery, the kind her grandfather used to write his firm, icy correspondences, and began to write her own letter. But this one wasn't for press. It wasn't for the foundation board. It wasn't for the estate. It was for Wren. My darling girl, one day, when you're old enough to wonder who you are and where you came from, I want you to read this. I want you to know that you were born not out of legacy or expectation or plans made by others, but out of love. The kind that was brave enough to risk everything, even its own place in the world. You made me fight for my truth. You made me find my voice again. And though the world may remember me as an heiress, or a headline, or a daughter who once walked away, I hope you remember me as someone who finally came home. Love is not a transaction. It's not earned through obedience or reputation. It's given, freely, often quietly, sometimes through a shoulder offered in an airport when you're too tired to cry. That's how I met your father. Not by blood, but by choice, by kindness, by everything that truly matters. One day you'll understand. Until then, grow brave, grow kind, grow free. All my love. Mom Grace folded the letter and slipped it into a lavender-colored envelope. She tucked it into Wren's baby book beside a photo from that snowy night at Gate 17. Then she exhaled, and for the first time in years, felt something new settle in her chest. Peace, Moxite. That night, as the stars blinked awake above the quiet hills of Idaho, Grace and Elliot sat by the piano once more. The fire glowed behind them, Wren asleep upstairs. Grace looked at him. You said once that you weren't used to being written into good stories, he smiled. Still true. She leaned her head against his shoulder. We'll get used to it. Boise Airport looked different in the daylight. Less weary, less cloaked in quiet struggle. The same glass walls still faced the snowy tarmac, and the same dull announcement chimes played every few minutes. But somehow, it all felt more open. Now, less like a place where people waited to escape, and more like a place where people arrived changed. Elliot stood near Gate 17, the same gate where everything had begun. His boots were scuffed, his bag small, his coat zipped up against the Idaho cold. It had been weeks since that night on the bench, the night Grace had fallen asleep on his shoulder, and unknowingly given him back a part of himself he thought was long gone. Now he was standing in the exact spot where she'd first slumped down with a feverish baby and a trembling jawline trying to disappear. And now he was the one about to disappear. He'd tried to tell himself this trip was temporary, just a few days away to help a friend with a home rebuild outside Bend. But he'd packed too neatly, left too many notes, given Grace too many quiet looks at dinner, too many long pauses when she asked, "Are you sure you need to go?" He told himself she needed space, that maybe love built too fast might crumble under the weight of its own rush. But the truth was simpler. He was scared of what it meant to be truly seen, to be chosen. Because when you've lost before, when you've stood in burning buildings and had nothing but ashes left, it's easier to run before the heat rises again. The final boarding call echoed over the intercom. Elliot's name appeared on the screen. He took a breath, gripped the handle of his bag, and turned Elliot. The voice cut through the noise like a chord struck clean across a piano. He turned back. Grace stood at the far end of the terminal, breathless cheeks flushed from cold or adrenaline or both. In her arms, Wren was bundled in soft pink wool, wide-eyed and gurgling. Snow clung to the hem of Grace's coat. Passengers looked. Someone reached for their phone. But Grace didn't care. She hurried forward, her voice cracking as she said, "Again, don't get on that plane." Elliot dropped his bag. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said. "I wasn't sure you'd leave," she replied, voice trembling. People made room for her as she stopped in front of him, heart pounding, baby, squirming softly in her arms. "I didn't come to ask you to stay out of obligation," Grace said. "I came because I've spent most of my life not saying what I feel until it's too late. I won't do that again." He looked at her, unsure if the words building in his chest would come out whole. "Grace." She stepped closer. "I don't need a fairy tale. I don't need promises written in stone. But I want you to know that you're the first man who ever stood still long enough for me to rest, and the only one who never asked me to be anything but real." Wren cooed softly between them, reaching a tiny hand toward Elliot's coat. He smiled, his voice low. "I didn't think I was ready to be someone's future." "You already are," she said. "You just forgot to believe it." He closed the distance between them, not in a cinematic rush, but in the quiet, certain way of someone choosing to stay when it's easier to go. His hand gently touched the back of Wren's head. "And what about her? Is she ready to deal with me playing off-key lullabies and burning pancakes?" Grace laughed through tears. "She already thinks you're a magician." "I think I'm starting to agree." They stood there, the three of them in the middle of Gate 17, no longer strangers, no longer uncertain. And as Elliot bent his head and pressed his lips softly to Grace's forehead, applause broke out around them, not wild, not forced, but warm, gentle. Not because they were newsworthy, but because they were true. Later that evening, back at the estate, Elliot unpacked his small bag. Grace placed his boots by the fireplace, like she had always meant to make room for them there. Wren crawled in circles around the living room rug, giggling at nothing in particular. Grace watched him from the doorway, arms crossed, eyes soft. I thought you were running, she said. I was, he admitted. But I forgot that you can't outrun what finally makes you whole. She stepped closer. Then what now? He looked around the room, the firelight flickering, the soft hum of home settling back into itself. Now, he said, we build something that lasts. One room, one laugh, one imperfect song at a time. That night, Grace found another letter. This one wasn't from her grandfather. It was from Elliot. Written in simple script, tucked inside the coat she had worn the night they met. Grace, if you're reading this, it means I found the courage to stay. I wrote this when I first realized I was falling, not just for your quiet strength, or for the way Ren looks at you, like you hold the moon, but for the way you made me remember who I am. You didn't need me to save you, but you let me stand beside you anyway. That's something I never thought I'd be worthy of. This shoulder is yours now if you'll still have it. E. Grace folded the letter slowly, tears silent, but sure. Outside the window, snow began to fall again, soft, unhurried, and full of promise. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was waiting at a runway to leave. She felt like she'd finally arrived. Spring arrived quietly at Langford Estate. Not in a sudden rush of color, but in the patient way of things that had waited long enough. The snow receded. The ground, once cold and indifferent, began to soften. Buds pushed up through the frost-creased soil, as if unsure they were allowed to bloom. Grace stood at the edge of the old greenhouse, now no longer broken. The panes had been scrubbed clean, the frame reinforced, and its skeletal silence replaced by green life, curling toward the glass. Rows of seedlings stretched upward, lavender, rosemary, marigolds, and lemon balm. Herbs for healing, flowers for remembering. At the center was a single raised bed, bordered in reclaimed wood. A hand-painted sign above it read, Wren's Garden. A place named, not for power, but for new beginnings. Elliot knelt inside, guiding Wren's tiny fingers to press soil around a sprig of sage. She squealed with delight, cheeks streaked with earth, her laughter bouncing off the glass like sunlight. She keeps trying to eat the basil, he said over his shoulder. She has good taste, Grace replied, smiling as she stepped inside. The air smelled of damp soil and sun-warmed thyme. It smelled like life starting again. She remembers this place, Grace said, watching her daughter with quiet awe. She should. It's where she was first safe. Grace reached for Elliot's hand. You made it safe. No, he said, gently squeezing her fingers. We did. Later that afternoon, the three of them walked the estate grounds as a family, no longer visitors, no longer ghosts. The main house had changed in small ways that made all the difference. Doors stayed open now. Music played softly in hallways. The piano keys bore fingerprints, and the kitchen table was cluttered with crayons and fruit bowls instead of stiff linens and silence. Grace no longer wore shoes indoors. Wren crawled freely, trailed by a rescue mutt named Huck they'd adopted together one rainy Thursday from the county shelter. Elliot had sanded down the nursery floorboards himself, humming while he worked. It was a house being lived in. And for the first time in generations, it was being loved. That weekend, Grace hosted an afternoon tea. Not a gala, not a press event, just an open-door invitation for women from the shelter neighbors and community leaders. Mismatched chairs were pulled into a wide circle on the front lawn. Tablecloths fluttered in the breeze. Children darted between rose bushes and rustling branches. No cameras, no speeches, just voices rising in the warm Idaho air, stories being shared over scones and sweet tea. Joni, the shelter director, leaned in beside Grace as she poured lemonade. You know, she said, when I first saw you in that photo, I thought, there's a girl who's trying to disappear without vanishing. Grace glanced over at Elliot, who was attempting unsuccessfully to keep Wren from decorating Huck with flower petals. I think I just needed someone to see me without asking me to explain everything first, she said. Joni nodded. We all need that. And now, look at you giving it back. That night, Grace and Elliot sat on the front porch. Swing Wren asleep upstairs, Huck curled at their feet. The stars came out one by one, shy at first, then steady. The kind of sky that reminded you of how vast the world could be, and how lucky you were to share even one corner of it with someone who stayed. Grace leaned her head on Elliot's shoulder. You know what today is, she asked. Sunday, she swatted his arm playfully. 1 year since that flight. He looked out across the lawn, thoughtful. Feels like another lifetime. In some ways, it was. He turned toward her, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. Would you go back and change anything? She thought for a long moment. No, she said. Because every hard step led me here. To this porch swing, he teased. To this porch swing. To this baby. To you. He paused, then reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. She froze. No, it's not that, he laughed. Relax. He pulled out a small, folded note, worn and creased. I wrote this the day after that photo went viral, he said. Didn't give it to you, because I thought it sounded too sentimental. But I think it's time. He handed it to her. Grace unfolded the note slowly. Home isn't a place, Grace. It's a moment, a breath, a look. It's the space where someone finally rests because they trust the roof won't fall. You were that moment for me. Now I want to spend the rest of my life building that roof for you. Grace looked up, tears brimming. This is the most beautiful non-proposal I've ever received. Elliot grinned. We've still got time for the real one. She smiled through tears. Let's not rush. Some things are too good to speed through. He nodded. Then, under a canopy of stars, he kissed her, not as a promise of forever, but as a celebration of now. Inside the nursery, Wren stirred in her sleep. Her tiny fingers clutched a plush rabbit. On the windowsill next to the baby monitor sat a silver picture frame. Inside, the grainy airport photo. Below it, etched on the brass plate, the shoulder America forgot it had. It wasn't about the fame anymore. It never had been. It was about the shoulder, the moment when everything changed. We'd love to know, where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. Whether you're listening from a quiet town in the Midwest, a big city on the coast, or somewhere halfway around the world, your presence here means more than you know. If this story touched your heart, and you'd like to hear more stories about quiet miracles, human kindness, and second chances, don't forget to subscribe and tap the bell so you never miss a new one. From all of us here, thank you for spending your time with us today. Until next time, stay kind, stay hopeful, and take good care of your heart.